So let's talk a little bit about filler words. I think this is a really exciting topic. I find that like is a filler word that I hear a lot. I use it. I hopefully not as much on the podcast as I do outside of the podcast. But which ones are the most common filler words that you see?
I see very often like. I see very often or so. All of those are things I commonly see. And these are things that people are usually not aware of. And what I really liked, what you talked about before, is how you're analyzing your communication, seeing how it could be better. Most people don't listen to themselves or watch themselves back on recordings, and so they don't know how to improve. But once I start to point out, hey, you're using a lot of these words that are making it hard for me to understand what you're saying, maybe instead of those filler words, you can pause instead. So take the time to think instead of needing to fill every silence with sound. And that's what I've seen helps a lot of people overcome that.
Chris, it's great to have you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Chris, and what I do as founder and CEO of The Hidden Speaker is I help tech professionals become confident communicators. And I decided to go on this mission because while working in the tech and data industry, I saw many colleagues around me suffer in their career potential and hit ceilings in their career because they couldn't communicate, tell a story, or speak with confidence. And I said, this is one of the biggest roadblocks and challenges in our industry, and I want to do my part to help resolve it. So what I do now through private coaching, an online course, and company workshops is train teams and individuals to learn the techniques, the tips, the templates for effective, concise, and confident communication.
When you say you saw people hit ceilings, was this, for example, someone stuck in the same position for a very long time and you watched them communicate and kind of inferred that that's probably holding them back? Or did you hear from people who were struggling to get promoted? Do you have any specific examples of the kinds of issues you saw?
Yeah, there was one person who reached out to me as a client in my first year of coaching. And he said that he wasn't promoted for 15 years because of communication skills specifically. His manager kept telling him year after year, hey, I know you want to be promoted, but you need to work on these communication skills, which are essential for your next role. Unless you do that, I can't raise you to that position. I also knew one person when I was working in the industry, best data engineer I knew, proficient at every kind of skill I could think of. If I had a question, he had the answer. Unfortunately, he was eventually moved away from our team. And the biggest reason that I believe was attributed to that was whenever he had to present the results of his work, they weren't clear. And so our manager didn't really understand the impact of what he was doing and eventually didn't see much use for him to continue on the team. So many examples of that. And for that reason, many clients reach out to me because they understand that communication is this secret ingredient necessary for success in those leadership positions.
Is it uniform across roles, the prevalence of this problem, or do you feel like this is more of a problem in technical positions where maybe communication wasn't emphasized during the studies?
I think it's especially prominent in technical positions because I work with a lot of scientists and researchers and data and tech folk. And across the board, I see a lot of commonalities. One is we tend to not want to boast about the work we've done. We want the work to speak for itself. And I think a large part of this has to do with the scientific method way we've been trained to think. So we think we have to be super objective about our work. We have to come up with this hypothesis and run an experiment to make sure the results are reproducible. And we can't say anything about how we feel about it because feelings are messy and subjective and shouldn't be part of this process. And it's because of that that we don't tend to work on communication skills, or it's not heavily included in our professional development.
Right. So it sounds almost to me like there's two layers. One is, I guess, presentation of the dry facts, right? Which would be, I don't know, how do you organize your appendix of your technical report, right? That should be very fact-based, right? But then the other part is how do you wrap or package your message? For example, how do you write the abstract of or an executive summary, right? And those sound like two slightly different types of communication. And before we go into the second one, I want to stay a little bit on the first one, which is forget about presenting to an external audience of non-technical people. Suppose you're a data scientist and you're presenting to your data science manager, who's also a technical person. How do you present your facts, right? And I teach at USC, and what I see students struggle with a lot is forget about the executive summary and driving home the main point. They struggle to even present the facts in a way that is coherent and easy to understand for a technical person. Is that something that you also see in your work, or do you focus more on the latter part of general communication to non-technical stakeholders?
I've seen both sides of the fence. So on the one hand, we have when we as technical people need to communicate to non-technical audiences. So that's one vein of communication. And the other one would be what you're talking about, which is we as technical professionals talking to fellow technical professionals. And I believe there are commonalities of best practices across both those domains. For technical professionals talking to technical professionals, we can use a lot more jargon with each other. That's totally fine because we all understand it and it's a very convenient shorthand. For best practices to presenting the facts using that jargon, I always recommend to make sure it's successful, we need to understand our audience. What happens very often that I see is technical work is explained in very technical terms, which is okay, but it doesn't get to what our audience needs to do about that information. I think that's the part we forget. We talk about everything we did, all the processes, the mechanics, the statistics, and the data. We forget, what do people need to do once they've heard us talk about this? And that's the proper way to present the information, is saying, okay, this is what we found. Now, once we give that to you, this is what you can do about it. It's the call to action at the end. And when you orient your presentation around the action people can need to take based on the information, that's how you present the information well.
Okay. So it sounds like any presentation, really, whether it's technical or non-technical, should start with the question, how will the information I'm conveying here change people's actions after they have heard it, right?
Exactly.
Do you recommend writing that down as a question and an answer at the top just to have a guideline? Are there any kind of tips or algorithms, so to say, that you recommend for constructing presentations?
I recommend as a good best practice, even if you don't include it in your eventual presentation or slide deck, is putting together that executive summary slide that you mentioned before, because that forces you to condense all the information you want to talk about into one succinct document that people can decide on. And then what I typically recommend for those kinds of executive summaries is you have some kind of background details or information section. Get people up to speed with why is this important? Then you have some kind of key takeaway section. What do people need to remember about this information? And then finally, what are the recommended actions to take? So it's the what, the so what, the now what for your entire presentation. And once you do that in one concise decision document, then you can start fleshing it out into the rest of the presentation. So that one document is the seed from which a great presentation that's concise can be formed.
So you have an ebook that I think has many interesting tidbits. And one I liked was that you say that presentations often end with something that feels like, I think, microwave leftovers, where people kind of repeat things that they said previously. And that's kind of a low note to end on. And I think most presentations, quite frankly, end that way. So what do you recommend putting in that last slide on the presentation?
What I recommend for any presentation or story in general is it needs to start in one place and help us end up in a different and hopefully better place. So there is movement from here to here. And there's an arc that you go through, you take the listener on to get to that new point. So the conclusion, if you're just rehashing everything you said, you just end up in the same place. But if you talk about something, the same ideas that you've talked about, you wrap them in a new package, a new perspective way of looking at it, and you say, this is how you should look at this topic in this new light, given everything I've said, you end them up in a different place. And because of that, they feel transformed by the experience. They feel, oh, I learned something from this. And then they go on to remember your presentation.
And that also makes me think that when we start the presentation, where I imagine we typically describe some kind of problem that we're solving, right? We can describe the same problem, but in a way that feels more positive or negative, in the sense that if we start by describing a problem and we emphasize why that problem is hard and why we haven't solved it, right? We're kind of placing the start at a lower point, which makes it easier for the end to look like a higher point of the presentation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree 100%.
So this suggests that when we compose a presentation, we shouldn't just be thinking about how do I line up the facts, but really how do I wrap the facts in a narrative where necessarily that narrative involves, I don't want to say manipulating people's emotions, right? But we have to think about people's emotions when we compose the narrative.
I would say that every great memorable presentation creates a significant gap between where we are and where we want to be. So if we start out where we are and it's bad and we're emphasizing those pain points at the beginning, then we're really, really low. And we see this is where we want to be. It's really, really high up here. How do we get there? That's what my presentation is about. And if you do that, then it's a memorable experience.
From a practical standpoint, are there any do's and don'ts in the sense of don't use small fonts or use small fonts or no more than X words per slide, things like that?
I tend to not like universal best practices because I believe that best practices are best for the audience you're speaking to. You have to adjust it for each one. Generally speaking, you don't want small fonts. But then what does small mean? And that would depend on your audience. Perhaps if they're an older audience, you want to make sure they're larger fonts so they can actually see it. But generally, you want everything that you put on the slide to be clear. So whatever serves that purpose would be best. Sometimes there are recommendations out there that you have to have exactly 10 slides. I don't think that's very useful because what if you have very little on each slide? Then maybe you need a longer slide deck. What if you jam pack your slides with information? Then maybe 10 slides is too much. So I tend to not go for universal best practices that specify exact numbers to do for everything, but just say for the audience I'm speaking to, what visual elements can I tweak to make it more clear for them?
Do you recommend using animations, or again, that's a thing that depends entirely on the situation?
I generally recommend to avoid animations that distract. So in early PowerPoint, I think there were animations to sort of do these curtain effects or swivel in and star and all these things. And I don't think that adds very much to the presentation, except distracting them from the point of it. But if you use just simple animations to make things appear, then you can gradually reveal your information. So if you have a slide, for example, that talks about 3 points that you want to discuss regarding some kind of scientific research you've done, instead of just showing it all at the same time and then people have to read it all, you can just animate them in simply one at a time as you get to each one. And in that way, it makes the experience more enlivening because things are changing and information is being revealed, and it keeps the audience interested.
So beyond the things we've already discussed, what are the most common presentation mistakes you see people make?
I see most often slides that are just covered with information and text and diagrams and visuals, just too much that wouldn't be easy to process. So my general recommendation for slides is people should be able to get your point within a few seconds of the slide coming up on the screen. If not, and it takes a minute for them to read through, it's not an effective slide. Because the purpose of a presentation is for them to listen to you speak, and the slides should just be there as visual support, not the slides leading it and you're just there to read it verbatim. And an example I like to use for my clients is if you were to present a slide covered with text and then you just read it line by line, that is an extremely tedious experience for the person on the other side because they can read it much faster than you can speak. So you're just making yourself redundant and a waste of your audience's time.
So really a benchmark could be are the slides self-explanatory, right? If they're like a book, then the presenter is not really necessary.
Right, exactly. They should complement instead of repeat the words we need to say.
So looking back at your career at various companies, did you see this pattern that people who were at much higher positions tended to be good communicators as well?
I saw a mix. I saw CEOs, people in those positions, tended to be really good communicators. I did see managers who were recently promoted. Communication was something they needed to learn as part of the process of that kind of transition. For example, I knew one manager who used to be an individual contributor. So he used to create dashboards and reports as his daily job. Then he was promoted to a managerial position. And that transition was very difficult because he needed to do less developing and more managing. and communicating to people what they needed to do to empower them to do great work instead of him doing it for them. So I do see that transition difficult sometimes, but across the board in leadership positions, communication is that essential skill to succeed.
So if we think about communication, say for someone working at a company, one type of communication could be you are going to present something, and so you have time to prepare a presentation, you can rehearse it if you want, and so on. A different type of communication is the one that happens every day in meetings. So we talked a little bit about the first type of communication. For the second one, what are the things you see people struggle with? And maybe it's different types of things for different types of people.
Yeah, it's absolutely different types of things for different types of people. I know from my personal experience and working with clients that it's largely dependent on your personality. So for more extroverted personalities, they're comfortable talking on the spot, ideas come to them, they bring it up during the meeting. But for more introverted personalities like myself, it takes a lot longer to compose a thought and feel comfortable saying it out loud because you want to make sure everything you say means something and provides value. And for clients who experience challenges with that, I recommend to them, at least starting out, come prepared to the meeting with what you want to say. So you know who's going to be there, you know the topic that's going to be under discussion. If the meeting's planned well, they send the agenda in advance. And then you can say, okay, I can bring up this point that I know from my area of expertise that people want to know about. I can bring up this point because I know someone in the meeting is probably going to disagree with this, and I can have a rebuttal prepared. And I can ask these kinds of questions. And if you come prepared, then in the meeting, you don't have to worry and stress and feel anxious about coming up with things on the spot because you have your material prepared. And then over time, it'll become faster and faster. It'll become a shorter duration with which you need to compose your thoughts on the spot.
So you come prepared to the meeting, and maybe you're the type of person who is more introverted. Sometimes you have to interrupt people to make yourself heard. And some people find it more challenging to interrupt others. Do you have any tips for that kind of problem?
Yeah, those are difficult situations. I have different tips I recommend in different situations. If we're in person, for example, we can have some nonverbal cues to indicate we want to speak. So we could raise our hand a little bit. We could act as if we're about to speak. And if people are watching and being attentive, they'll pick up on that and let us into the conversation. If they don't, then sometimes we need to have a little bit of overlapping talk. So as they're talking, we say, hey, I'd love to add on to that whenever you're done. Something like that, just to indicate, hey, I have a great idea. Let me share it once you've completed your thought. And if they continue to talk and we're not able to be included in the conversation, then there's another level we can go to where we can interject and say, hey, I'd love to share something after that. Or we can repeat ourselves a little bit and say, hey, when you get a chance, I'd love to talk more about that idea from this different perspective. So it's a little bit uncomfortable to do that because especially I notice with introverted professionals, we don't want to step on other people's toes. We don't want to steal the spotlight. We want other people to shine. But if we want to be noticed in the workplace, be visible and respected, we need to insert ourselves in the conversation, especially in rooms dominated by more extroverted personalities. So it just takes practice to feel comfortable with that.
And I don't think there is any getting away from the necessity to talk over someone sometimes, right? And of course, it's not about kind of making a point over someone, but saying something like, let me interrupt here. And then it's also clear that you are interrupting because you have something to say.
Yes. And most of the time, I'll say, if this is a meeting with everybody who trusts and respects each other, if you indicate you want to speak and there's a good facilitator in the room, you will be given your turn.
Yeah. Well, and I also think people respect someone who has something to say, making sure that it gets said, because no one's going to do it for you. That's the unfortunate or fortunate truth of the matter.
Absolutely.
So I think for anyone listening, they can tell that you don't use a bunch of filler words and that the way you speak is pretty well thought through. And they may wonder, were you born this way, being a great communicator who doesn't use filler words, or is that something you trained yourself to do?
It's something I absolutely trained myself to do. And I tell this to people not because I want to showcase my own transformation, but to show them what's possible for themselves. And in high school and before that, I was the most quiet kid in the class and probably in the whole school. I hated speaking up in classroom. I hated raising my hand. I hated being called on. And it took me a lifelong transformation to work on myself and realize communication is really important for my career success and personal fulfillment. And I really needed to hunker down and try and expand my comfort zone. I was very comfortable being quiet, but I said, if I want to be visible, respected, get those promotional opportunities, career opportunities, I need to slowly become comfortable doing more. So I began to communicate more. Began in every meeting, come prepared with something I wanted to say, at least one thing. Then the next week, let me try to say two things, maybe. And then I keep expanding that, expanding. Then I volunteer for presentations. I say, okay, I really feel nervous about this, but let me push myself a little more. Until eventually, with all that practice, as with any skill we learn, I eventually was able to reach the point where I felt confident enough to teach this to others.
In those first iterations, was it more about going from not speaking to speaking up with your ideas, or were you also worried about the form in which you spoke, if you used filler words and the cadence of your voice and all of that kind of stuff?
I was worried about everything, and I was very self-conscious, very low self-esteem, didn't think much of what I had to say, didn't think anybody would actually care about what I had to say, but I said, I have to try. So at first, I just tried to say something. Even if it came out horribly, I tried to say something. I was okay with embarrassing myself a little bit. And then over time, as I started doing that, I said, what did I do that I could improve on? So maybe I used a bunch of filler words. Maybe next time I can try cutting those out. Or maybe I was a little rambly in the way that I delivered it. Maybe next time I can structure my thoughts in a better way. So using that kind of self-disciplined, careful gaze on what I was doing and how I could improve, that's how I eventually, through many iterations, reached a point of greater confidence.
Did it ever happen to you in the beginning that you felt you had embarrassed yourself in a meeting?
Yeah, so many times, so many times. And even in school, when I would raise my hand when I tried and I would blurt out something and I said, oh, that was horrible the way that I put that. I wish I hadn't said that at all. But then I had a new data point I could use to improve future iterations.
I think that's a really important point. Unless you do something in practice, it's, I think, impossible to improve. When I edit the podcasts and I see the transcript, I can see black on white how many filler words I use, how many times. And of course, I try to improve upon that. And I guess hopefully I do, right? But the point is, I didn't realize how many filler words I was using until I actually saw it.
Exactly.
You said something interesting about giving a rambling response. So, do you have any recommendations for how to train yourself in giving concise and impactful answers? And if there is a structure to an answer, suppose someone asks you a question that requires a complex answer, how do you structure that complex answer in a way that is clear and coherent?
The framework I usually recommend, generally speaking, as a good default to try, is point, reason, example, point. So PREP. And the reason why it works is it focuses so much on the point you want to say. That's the key to being concise, is knowing your North Star. What do you want to say to the other person? Then everything else just supports that. So first you say your point in one short sentence. I believe XYZ. Then you give a reason for that. I believe XYZ because of ABC. And then you give an example. And that's what makes it more concrete and detailed so the other person can understand it. And that's where you say, I believe XYZ for ABC reason, because I was once in this time. You can tell a story, give an anecdote, provide another example. And then you tie it back to the points. You remind people why you're talking in the first place, and it drives home the message you want to say. So PREP is a fantastic framework for concise speech.
So an example would be, suppose we're presenting the output of a forecasting model to a leader who's making decisions based on those forecasts. And they will ask, should we trust this forecast? And so you can say, I think we should trust this forecast. So that's the point. Then the reason is this particular model has a low model risk because X, Y, and Z. And then you could give an example. The model risk here is driven by these inputs, which we measure with very high fidelity. So that would be the example. Then you drive back the point. So in summary, we should trust the forecast in this situation.
Perfect. Yeah, that was exactly that kind of circle that the point goes through. So it really makes sure that people understand that what your message is.
Another answer structure that I've heard about is the sandwich, where it's the yes, no, right? I think if someone, I hope I didn't flip that, but if someone asks you, can we do this? and the answer is kind of obviously no, but you don't want to be the person who always says no. And so you can wrap it in. Maybe you explain it, because I feel like I'm not doing a great job explaining my point here.
I'm not too certain about the no, yes, no specifically as a framework, but what I do recommend as a framework for assertion is you begin by acknowledging what the other person said, not outright disagreeing with them, because it's never good to do that. It just shuts the conversation down. So you acknowledge something about what they said, perhaps something that you really respected genuinely about it. Then you can ask questions to really understand. And asking questions is a great way to have people open up, and it prevents things from getting defensive and offensive. So if someone disagreed with your forecasting model, for example, they said, I don't think this is good for us to use. You can begin by saying, I understand your concerns about this specific detail. That's a valid concern. Let me ask you a little bit more about why you believe that is not a functional part of the model, or something like that. You ask questions, and then when you reach a point where you both understand each other, then you can assert what you believe. And you can say, if they didn't understand the full picture, you can say, I want to clarify this particular point and make sure that it wasn't misunderstood. Or if they still disagree with you, you can say, hey, let's discuss this at a later point. I can come back to you with a more fully fleshed analysis of this and explain the reasons why we believe it's X, Y, and Z. So there are many ways to approach it, but generally speaking, it's what you said, which is you don't want to outright disagree. You want to complement what they say and hopefully move it in a different direction.
That makes sense. And I really like the framework of asking questions, because so often do we not understand the point of the other person. And also, even if the other person hypothetically said something that is just completely wrong, right? Which could be the case. Sometimes you have people who are not subject matter experts who say something outrageously not true, and you are the expert and you really know that's not true. But maybe a better way than just telling them this is not true and it's stupid, you can ask questions where they themselves understand that what they said actually doesn't make sense.
Exactly. The best method of persuasion is having people convince themselves rather than you telling them what to do.
There is this general concept of, for any topic where I have a strong conviction, what would I need to learn to change my mind? So in theory, right, we should be open to changing our minds about most things, given sufficient evidence, right? Then there's, of course, things where maybe it's more belief-based and so on, but in terms of kind of factual things, right, one should be open to new evidence.
Yeah, this is a tricky thing, especially if you go into political territories where facts don't convince. It's really that belief-based system. We believe this because of the length of time we've believed it, because people in our social circle believe it. So it's really important to consider how people think in order to hopefully persuade them of a different way of thinking.
Well, and I think politics is especially tricky because often the beliefs are based on kind of notions of causality, right? That immigration will cause X group to lose their jobs, or the inflation is because of this or that, right? And as an economist, where what we do is try to measure and study causality, we understand how incredibly tricky and nuanced it is to even get to these kinds of statements. But I guess on average, no one thinks about it, right? Like they see two lines that move together and they say, oh, this caused this other thing.
Yeah, this is something we have to be so careful of as data professionals as well, is if we have a graph of two variables moving simultaneously, we can't imply causation when it's just a simple correlation. We have to be very careful about the way we present information.
So something that you focus on is how to tell a powerful story with data. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that. And as part of my question is, I would like you to distinguish between two types of situations. One is we have a very clear-cut story. We have a hypothesis and the data supports it in a very clear way. But then we can have another type of story where it's very nuanced, right? Maybe the politics or health example applies here. That does this diet help with weight loss, right? And we can't say this diet helps with weight loss. We have to say, well, it sometimes helps, and there are these nuanced factors, and the evidence is quite contradictory in this area. So how do we think about telling a powerful story with data in these two types of situations?
I think especially the second example you gave of this is a really multifaceted argument. How do we even approach talking about this? That's a really important one to pull apart. And what I always recommend for building any data story or presentation is it needs to be accessible and simply understandable. So the message at the very top, the thesis that we're going for, we must aim to simplify it without losing the veracity of it. So let's say that your thesis is there is no ultimate diet. There are all of these different things to consider, complexities for individual people with different health conditions and age groups. That's the thesis. Well, maybe we can break that apart to make it a little more simply understandable. Let's say we target one specific age group. We say people who are from 18 to 29 and they have these health conditions and they live in this part of the world, this diet may be good for them. And then we can have another example from a different part of the world. Or we could take a different tact and say, this diet, the Mediterranean diet, is great for these reasons, has these specific benefits. And then this diet has these specific benefits. So we break it apart into more manageable pieces that are each in and of themselves easy to digest and process. And then they add up to our thesis, which hopefully should be understandable as a whole.
I feel like you see a little bit of this when you look at YouTube thumbnails from podcasts. Often they will have these outrageous sounding statements, of course, to attract clicks. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, that's kind of what social media is about. But then once you listen to the podcast, you see the nuance of it.
I see this all the time. And we have to play that fine line of getting attention, but not overdoing it to the extent that we lose the essence of what we're talking about. So being as truthful as we can, but still engaging attention.
So data professionals often, right, like the average data scientist and the average company, when they make a presentation, they pull together some charts from their Jupyter notebook or wherever they have the charts and paste them in whatever presentation software they use. But I find that it's not often that people deliberately spend a large amount of time on the charts themselves. How important is that? And do you have any tips for people who would like to bring their charts to the next level?
The charts are so important because we as humans are such visual creatures. And if you have a chart and it's all the default settings from your tool of choice, it has all these grid lines and all these labels and all these colors, it's going to be very hard to understand. But if you take the time to really think about all the small details that you're doing, you can make the visual a lot more clear and concise with a very simple message. And then people just get it. As we talked about earlier, for any slide or any visual, it should be understandable within a few seconds of looking at it without people trying to struggle. Because our job as designers and presenters is to provide a simple guided experience of the material for people. So they don't have to struggle through it just like we did. So for any chart, I recommend, for example, as common best practices, having a clear title. What is the takeaway people should understand? I see very often charts that have the variables that are being displayed. So sales over time, and that's it. But what about sales over time is important? So talking about the so what, and perhaps what should we do about it? What is the root cause of it? So we can talk about that in the title. And then in the graph itself, focusing on clarity and simplicity. So rather than a rainbow of colors for all these different categories, question, should we have all these categories to begin with? Can we aggregate some of them to simplify the representation? Maybe we shouldn't use this rainbow. Maybe I can just have everything be gray and then just use blue or some other bolder color to highlight the line people should pay attention to. So you're carefully nudging all these visual elements around so that people look at where you want them to look. And that's what makes a chart compelling.
And I guess this is where we also get into the territory of colors mattering. If we're showing sales dipping, maybe the line should be red. And if it's growing, maybe green. And maybe we don't want to imply a positive or negative association and we just make it blue or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So it sounds like the chart itself is telling a story, obviously. And maybe the titles shouldn't just be a statement of the data that's in the chart, like you said, sales over time, but can make an informative statement like sales over time are rapidly increasing, or 2024 was a great year for sales, or something like that.
And this goes back to the idea that sometimes we're very hesitant to put a valuation on the data and say what it means. But we have to do that for executives to understand what they should do. And we're not manipulating them. We're not telling them what to do. We're giving our informed expert opinion and saying, hey, this is what we think. Here are some caveats, disclaimers, nuances around this. But if you can, all things considered, this is what this means. And then they can make the decision themselves. So it's really about making the message clear in our visuals.
I find that that's a good structure of having a statement where you do provide some valuation, right? Because that's what your job, that's what they're paying you for, to reach a conclusion, but then also have a very clear list of the caveats. And if anything, being able to coherently explain all the risks of the analysis or the model or the conclusions gives you validity and credibility as a scientist.
Absolutely. I work with a lot of professionals who say, oh, I can't say that, which is the message, because of all these things. And I can't say that confidently. And I say, you can do both. You can say what you believe confidently. And also, as we've been talking about, all the caveats and disclaimers and nuances around it. So you're giving both sides simultaneously and then letting the other person put it together.
One thing I say a lot when I work with forecasting models, just to make sure any decision maker audiences understand, is that we can't predict the future. That is really hard and no one has figured out how to do it. So all forecasting models are wrong. And it's more about understanding why they may be wrong more or less.
That's a perfect example. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about filler words. I think this is a really exciting topic. I find that like is a filler word that I hear a lot. I use it. I hopefully not as much on the podcast as I do outside of the podcast. But which ones are the most common filler words that you see?
I see very often like. I see very often or so. All of those are things I commonly see. And these are things that people are usually not aware of. And what I really liked, what you talked about before, is how you're analyzing your communication, seeing how it could be better. Most people don't listen to themselves or watch themselves back on recordings. And so they don't know how to improve. But once I start to point out, hey, you're using a lot of these words that are making it hard for me to understand what you're saying, maybe instead of those filler words, you can pause instead. So take the time to think instead of needing to fill every silence with sound. And that's what I've seen helps a lot of people overcome that.
I read somewhere that a practical tip for avoiding the and between the gaps of the words is to focus on the ending of the word when you end a sentence. So, for example, like here, I focus on sentence, and that focus prevents me from going into a filler of some sort.
Yeah, I was working with one client where in the middle of the sentence, he would insert a lot of the ums and the uhs. And I said, it's much more impactful if you end your sentence definitively and then you pause. And then when you know what to say, then you move on to the next sentence. So it's kind of creating a closure for your previous idea. And now we're starting something new. And people really lean into that pause because they want to know what happens next. So that's a really great technique.
So these are sentence ending fillers, the ums and ams, or the gaps in between. What are the fillers you see at the beginnings of sentences?
I see very often the ums and the uhs, and a lot more so or yeah or now. These are things that people say very much unconsciously. And as we've been talking about, it's when you point it out that they say, oh, yeah, I do say that a lot and I don't mean to. So maybe I can start taking that out.
So the substitute for a filler at the beginning, for example, right now I started my sentence with so a substitute. Is that a filler or is that not a filler?
I wouldn't say in that case it was, because it sounded like you were connecting from a previous idea. So, or therefore, this is what it is. But if you weren't using it for that particular meaning, then it might be more considered filler word. And in that case, you would just say you wouldn't have the so at the beginning, you would just go a blah, 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 is blah, blah, blah.
An example would be, suppose we're presenting something and we go to the next slide that's not a continuation of the previous slide, but a completely new point. We might be inclined to say, so in North America, these are sales, whatever. We would say in North America, sales, this and that.
Exactly. And another filler I do see at the beginning of sentences or between slides is, on the next slide, I'm going, and let me change to the next slide, is a common one. And I recommend that presenters take that out because we know you're going to the next slide. Instead, you can say, on the next slide, I'm going to talk about blah, blah, blah. Or on the previous slide, we talked about this. Now let's move forward to this. So it's a more meaningful transition than an empty filler.
You know is another one I hear people use a lot. I talked to someone a few weeks ago who used you know around 4 times in each sentence. It's one I used to overuse a lot more than I do now, hopefully. And it's tricky because it's not as obvious as like or It sounds more like a proper word.
I do these video breakdowns of CEOs who are communicating publicly. And I was watching one where the came up very often, at least 4 times in the sentence. And so in the video breakdown that I was putting together, I said, yeah, if that was taken out, the message would be so much more clear. And it's just these little things that really add up.
What are the practical tips for someone who wants to get better beyond recording themselves and analyzing what it is they do a lot that they shouldn't be doing?
That would be the number one tip I usually give, which is to watch yourself. But another one would be find people that you really admire in terms of their public speaking. So for a lot of people, that could be Steve Jobs, or that could be Simon Sinek, or that could be Martin Luther King Jr., all these big figures that we know, and watch what they do and see, are there certain techniques that you could adopt from them that still feel authentic to you and can enhance your speech? So perhaps for Steve Jobs, he's really great at emphasizing how he feels about something. So he'll put up the iPod on the screen and say, look how amazing that is. So that's one thing. Maybe I can talk more about how I feel about the things that I'm describing. Or you can talk about Martin Luther King Jr., who uses a lot of these metaphors and these analogies to really make it more colorful in the way that you think about it. And Obama does this too, where he has this very descriptive language about certain things, or the rhetoric that he uses. He usually uses things like the rule of three. So he'll talk about something and something and something else. And that 3-part series is very impactful for us to listen to because we're hardwired to really pay attention to things that come in groups of 3. So all these little things you can watch out for in people you admire and then see what works for you.
And you mentioned see what works for you. And I guess that's an important point, that we all have to find our own voice, right? We're not going to imitate, whether it's Obama or Steve Jobs or whoever else. For example, one thing that I've thought about a lot is, how fast do you speak? I have a tendency to speak fast. Right now, I'm speaking extremely slow for being myself. But then some people speak much more slowly, and it sounds more thoughtful, to be honest, than when someone speaks really, really fast. But are there any kind of hardwired rules of this? You should actually never do this, and this should not be your voice.
I was putting together a video breakdown of 2 CEOs who have very different speaking rates. So one is the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, and he speaks relatively quickly and with high energy, and with a lot of hand gestures and body language. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Google CEO, Sundar Pichai, and he talks a lot more slowly with more reserved body language and a more quiet confidence. Neither one is right. Both are authentic to their personalities. The only problem with rate of speech is when it distorts the clarity of your message. So if Satya, the one who talks really high energy and really quickly, if he was talking so fast that I couldn't pick up the words, then that would be a problem. Or if Sundar, who talks relatively slow compared to Satya, if he was talking so slow that I forgot what he was saying, then that would be a problem. So it's kind of relative, but each person has to find a speaking rate that works for them and that is best understood by the people they talk to.
What about the pitch of the voice itself? Are we just born with a certain sounding voice and that's it? Or can we train our voice to sound better?
I believe we can all train our voices to be more engaging. And something I like to do when I teach vocal variety and tone is thinking about music. And because I come from a musical background, thinking about any piece of music you listen to, the pitches change all the time. The volume changes all the time. And that's what makes us interested in it, because it sings to us and it's constantly in flux. If so many technical presentations I listen to, however, are just the same tone constantly throughout and just the same volume throughout as well, and there's no excitement or musicality to it. So a great way I recommend to make the voice itself more engaging, but still authentic, is seeing how can I make it sound more musical? Can I emphasize certain words more so people really pay attention to it? Maybe I can slow down for really important moments, or I can really speed up when there's something really exciting for me to talk about. So it's just pulling all these levers that we're not aware of when we speak, because we're just talking for the sake of talking because it's natural, but really paying attention to those little things we can do, maybe increasing the volume, decreasing the rhythm, and that's how we make the voice more engaging.
Is that why British English sounds so engaging? Because they have more of this kind of cadence that's a little bit different than the American English, you think?
I would say so. And I also believe that British actors are commonly cast as villains because the way they speak is also more enunciated and articulated. And that is commonly associated with intelligence. And villains are typically intelligent people to fight off the hero. So I believe that we can pay attention to all those things, especially enunciation, to give off a certain air that we want.
That's so interesting. And that's actually a good segue into another question I had, and namely, people who are not native English speakers may have varying degrees of difficulty with enunciation. So maybe someone who's Italian does not have a problem with pronunciation of certain sounds in English the same way someone who comes from, say, China does. And we all have a natural cadence to our native language. And what tips do you have for someone who feels they have a very strong language barrier when it comes to speaking clearly in English?
I work a lot with clients who are non-native English speakers, and this question comes up a lot, which is my accent a problem? And I always tell them, your accent is not the problem. It is lack of clarity that is the problem. So your accent is a beautiful uniqueness to the way that you speak, and no one else speaks the way that you do with your voice and the way and with all the little nuances of your language. But it only becomes a problem if you're using your accent and people don't understand what you're saying. Then it's important to work on greater clarity. So perhaps there are certain elements of the way you speak certain words that can be lessened, or you can practice speaking the words more slowly and really sounding out every single syllable and working on, can I make it more clear? So accent is not the issue. The only issue is if people don't understand.
And would you say that depending on what your native language is, you may have a problem pronouncing very specific letters or vowels, and then you could just practice that sound, right? Because in the end, it's about, can your mouth and your vocal cords make the correct sound to some extent?
Exactly. And what I like to talk about with my clients is every language has its own music to it. And it also has a certain way that we move our mouth to pronounce certain words. So I come from a Chinese background, and for people in my family, it's sometimes hard to pronounce the R letter. So it comes out more like an L sound. And so one thing that could be worked on if you wanted to enhance the clarity of words with the R in it are to really see how people who pronounce in native English speakers, how they pronounce the R, and try and move your mouth more so to that. And that's a great way to perhaps lessen elements of the accent that reduce your clarity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another aspect of communication is the words themselves that you use. So, beyond not using filler words, there is also the question of what words do you use when you speak. And from what I understand, is people have an active and a passive vocabulary repository, and the active one, which obviously is much smaller, is what we use when we speak in everyday life. And when you look at great speakers, you often notice that they frequently use words that you would not use in everyday life. You know what they mean, but you just don't use them. Do you have any tips for improving your active vocabulary and how to find words that feel natural to you? Right? Because it's not about just opening the dictionary and finding some obscure sounding word and then throwing it into your daily presentation.
Absolutely. I think one thing that could be a great recommendation, especially for more technically minded professionals, is to read more. And that's something that I love doing when I was a kid. I have less time now, but I love doing it as a kid, was reading even fantasy fiction books. And you can see the whole colorful plethora of words that they use in their writing that we can repurpose for our own speech. And it's similar to music in the sense that if you use the same note all the time, it gets really boring. But if you can expand the vocabulary of sounds that you can use and the words that you can use, that makes you so much more engaging to listen to as a speaker. So reading is a great way.
And maybe even writing.
And writing, yes.
Yeah. Because that forces us to think a little bit about. So something I see a lot in students writing, which I find very interesting, is that they're very prone to using words like intricate, very difficult, amazing, these kinds of all of these kind of superlatives and adjectives that convey a very big or very strong something, which actually detracts from the message, right? You can say, we performed this data analysis and this is what we found, or you can say, we performed this intricate, extremely difficult, and meticulous data analysis, which does not sound very credible somehow.
Yes. And we see this sometimes with ChatGPT too. If people use it to create posts on LinkedIn or comments for LinkedIn posts, you see very commonly these superlative words or things like, this is a game changer for blah, blah, blah. And it stands out to us because it doesn't sound truthful, as you said. It sounds like we're trying to emphasize and exaggerate something that perhaps doesn't deserve that degree of exaggeration. So it's very important to pay attention to the words we use and use them more carefully.
So, for people listening who want to improve their communication skills and maybe are interested in working with you, what kind of resources do you offer?
So I have my website, thehiddenspeaker.com, where I have a lot of blog posts talking about communication best practices for the workplace. I have the ebook that we talked about before, my ultimate data storytelling and presentation guide, where I have examples of how to start presentations, end them, communicating with stakeholders, how to tell the data story, present dashboards, and additional bonus resources from my YouTube channel. And the handle for that is @thehiddenspeaker. And that has, I think, now 100 plus videos on communication. So I try to demo it as much as I can so people can emulate it in their own time. So that's what I would recommend. I also have an online course that I teach covering communication best practices. And in 8 weeks, the goal is for every person who joins to begin to feel confident about how they think about communication, how they sound and look when they communicate, and how they communicate with storytelling and presentations. So those would be the resources I recommend.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel is important?
I think we covered a really great assortment of topics related to communication. And I guess a parting thought I'd want people to know is how powerful your voice is. I didn't know the power of my voice when I was a kid. I would just, when asked to speak, I would speak. But then I began to realize that if I used my voice in a certain way, using the things we talked about, vocal variety, assertiveness, pausing, people start to listen more. So if I paused just like I did right there, people would listen in a little bit more. And I could see that just through my voice alone and the words I chose to use and the way that I delivered it, I could change the way people thought. I could make people listen to me. And I could gain the confidence I had not had for so many years in my life. So for anyone listening, I would recommend realizing that you have so much power with your voice. When you find the way to use it authentically, using all the best practices we talked about, you have so much power in your voice to really change the people around you and perhaps even your entire workplace. So it's a critical skill to master.
And I imagine, as a word of encouragement, is if you are someone who is very shy and never speaks up and you start implementing these techniques that you mentioned, very quickly you start getting feedback from the world that will encourage you to continue.
Exactly. And that's what happened to me. It's what happens to a lot of my clients. They start changing the way that they speak and start seeing, yeah, this is really impacting people in a different way. I can do this. And it's that iterative cycle of, yeah, I can do this. Let me try something else, and doing it again and again and seeing that improvement. That is one of the most inspirational things.
Chris, this was great. Thank you so much. And we're going to link in the show notes to your resources and your website.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on.
You're so welcome.